On April 20th, The Hollywood Reporter published an interview with famed director David Lynch, talking about everything he's been doing while under lockdown. However, the thing that went viral was a quote about him having zero interest in Denis Villeneuve's upcoming Dune adaptation. That comment wasn't a slight against either Villeneuve himself or his movie, but rather a reflection on what a miserable experience David Lynch had making his adaptation of Frank Herbert's famed novel. To the point where the wound is still fresh, nearly 4 decades later. Let's hope Villeneuve won't be as traumatized during the making of his movie, but is there any chance he could be? Because that does invite a comparison between the two Dunes. Or rather, since one is being made in a vastly different era than the other, it invites a comparison between filmmaking in the 1980s and filmmaking today. In this editorial then, I will go through just what went so wrong with David Lynch's Dune that he remains traumatized over it to this day, and how what went wrong there was actually a common problem for filmmakers in an era where creativity thrived. We do not yet know how Denis Villeneuve's upcoming Dune will work out, but in making his movie today, he has to face a whole different set of challenges than Lynch did back in the 80s. And before rounding out, I have a special recommendation for everyone who loves, or are even fascinated by the movies and filmmaking authorship of the 80s. Frank Herbert's Dune already had a history in Hollywood long before David Lynch became attached to it. Alejandro Jodorowsky had spent years setting up his version of Dune with a number of spiritual warriors, including Moebius, H.R. Giger and Chris Foss, but in the end, they weren't able to raise the necessary funds to proceed, and although it would indirectly continue to influence Hollywood, that iteration of the movie itself collapsed. That's when Italian producer Dino De Laurentiis swooped in and picked up the Dune rights. After a false start under director Ridley Scott, Dino's daughter, producer Raffaella De Laurentiis, saw David Lynch's Elephant Man and decided he was the right man for Frank Herbert's novel. Not quite sure how she saw that. David Lynch was an auteur filmmaker, known for a number of shorts, most notably Eraserhead, prior to the commercial and critical success of his first real feature film, The Elephant Man. Following that success, he received a number of high-profile offers, including Return of the Jedi, but in the end, he agreed to write and direct Dune, even though he had not read the book, didn't know the story, and to top it off, he wasn't all that interested in science fiction. So yeah, good fit there. But this auteur filmmaker evidently felt his vision could be applied to Dune. Alas, his vision was compromised. In the April 20th interview, he told The Hollywood Reporter when they asked about his thoughts on Denis Villeneuve's Dune, "I have zero interest in Dune, because it was a heartache for me. It was a failure and I didn't have final cut. I've told this story a billion times. It's not the film I wanted to make. I like certain parts of it very much, but it was a total failure for me." Lynch has previously elaborated on this, explaining that while the commercial failure hurt, he would have recovered from that if it had been the movie he had wanted to make, and Dune simply wasn't. As he told The Hollywood Reporter, he didn't have final cut, which means he also didn't have full control over which version of the movie audiences in the end got to see. That's not unique to the 80s, of course. On the contrary, that's been a recurring heartache for filmmakers ever since the onset of cinema till this day. Because it's not the director's movie, it's the producer's. They foot the bill. They appoint the director who does a work for hire, and so naturally, the producer has final cut and the ultimate creative control. Yes, there's always been some exceptions to this along the way, but they are just that, exceptions. As a rule, the producer have ultimate creative control, and this is as true now as it was then. But what I think has changed between 1994 and now is how that creative control is exerted. There have always been dumbass producers that have delivered notes, either demanding cool things be taken out or stupid things put in. Still, I cannot help but observe that producers back in the 80s were more aware that they themselves were moneymen and not creatives, and so focused their meddling more on issues directly related to the bottom line than they did on creative matters. If creative matters were affected, that was mostly incidental and a byproduct of issues relating to the bottom line, said in a slightly different and slightly exaggerated way to get the point across. As long as the movie came in on time, on budget, secured the desired rating, and the finished product was within the allotted running time, the filmmakers could do pretty much whatever they wanted within those parameters. The producers of the time weren't afraid of taking risks. On the contrary, they sought them out. That led to so many 80s movies being crazy good, crazy bad, or just plain crazy. David Lynch's Dune is actually the perfect example of this. Raffaella De Laurentiis probably sought him out because he wasn't an obvious fit with the property. Neither was Ridley Scott before him, nor was Alejandro Jodorowsky before him, but they were all visionaries that would take the material in new and up till that point unimagined ways. You see, the De Laurentiis group were looking for a Star Wars of their own, and they knew they weren't going to get that by playing it safe. That would require some serious out-of-the-box thinking, and for that, they needed someone like David Lynch. Not the safe choice who had done another sci-fi that went nowhere before. De Laurentiis obviously was there during the scripting process, and not always in good ways. But even so, David Lynch actually got most of what he wanted into the movie, both in the screen story, the subtext, and the visuals. You might miss it at first glance, but there are things in that movie that would never have flown today. Any director even asking for what Lynch put into his movie today would have been forced to part ways with the studio over creative differences many times over. But back in the 80s, when Lynch wanted to put things in there that would have gotten a director blacklisted today, Dino De Laurentiis simply answered, okay. So in light of everything Lynch actually was allowed to put into the movie, what was the problem? Well, as I said, the producers were moneymen first and foremost. The filmmakers could do pretty much whatever they wanted, within certain parameters of course, and in the case of Dune in particular, those very parameters would turn out to be the problem. There was at one point talk of splitting the Dune adaptation into 2 movies even back then, which probably would have solved everything, but no serious talk. The producers weren't ready for that. From their point of view, Dune was one novel, and like all other movies based on novels, it would be one movie. Worse yet, when distributor Universal told Dino De Laurentiis that the movie could have a running time of a maximum of 2 hours. Dino didn't say, "My director says that can't be done, so we feel a running time of more than 3 hours is the way to go here." He said, "Okay," and then passed that mandate on to Lynch. When Lynch couldn't deliver a 2-hour cut he was pleased with, De Laurentiis had a 2-hour cut made that he was pleased with, regardless of what Lynch felt about it. That is what did the theatrical cut of the movie in, more than anything else. Condensing Frank Herbert's novel, and even Lynch's script and raw footage, into a 2-hour movie that also made sense, simply could not be done. Lynch was extremely upset with the release version, which despite all the designs and subtext that he got in there, narratively was not the movie he wanted to make. And then it bombed, and was ridiculed in a spectacular fashion to boot. Later, the studio put out an extended 3-hour version of the movie for TV, but this was no director's cut. Instead, it was another producer's cut, which still didn't use the footage that Lynch wanted. As such, he had his name removed from it. The extended TV cut is credited to director Alan Smithee, which is code for that the real director wants no blame for this, and it's credited to writer Judas Booth, a term Lynch coined to describe how he felt about the overall experience. In short, the downfall of David Lynch's Dune wasn't due to any restrictions in what he could put into the movie, but how long he had to tell the story. Plenty of great 80s movies could be told in 2 hours, but not this one. And that is a problem Denis Villeneuve's Dune won't have to face. For that, he can thank a movie mogul that also really made his mark in the 1980s. What really changed the industry in regards to how lengthy novels should be adapted was Lord of the Rings. In the latter half of the 90s, Peter Jackson pitched every studio in town with his proposed idea of a Lord of the Rings adaptation. But as was the idea for Dune at one point, he wanted to split it into 2 movies, which was still a new and scary proposition for the producers and moneymen, so they all passed on it. All save one. In a last-ditch effort before giving up and pulling the plug on it all, Peter Jackson pitched Bob Shaye of New Line Cinema. Instead of being taken aback by the idea of committing to 2 movies, Shaye asked Peter Jackson, "Isn't Lord of the Rings 3 books? Should it not be a trilogy?" The end result is movie history. Before this video, you might have seen a Masterclass commercial featuring some filmmaker or other creative. We actually have a Masterclass of our own, namely an in-depth interview with the very Bob Shaye, so be sure to check that out. Completely free of charge. Thanks to first and foremost Bob Shaye for showing the industry that splitting adaptations into multiple parts is a risk worth taking because it comes with a huge upside, as well as changes in how audiences consume their entertainment brought on by home media and binge watching. The running time restrictions that doomed David Lynch's Dune are a non-issue to Denis Villeneuve's Dune. Not only is his Dune split into 2 parts, like David Lynch wanted his Dune to be, Villeneuve is not bound by a 2-hour running time. If he decides that a 3-hour running time is what his vision for the first half of his Dune adaptation needs, then a 3-hour running time is what he will get. This is Villeneuve's opportunity. He is unbound by the restrictions that shackled David Lynch. But there is a flip side to that coin, and it doesn't just apply to Villeneuve, but all filmmakers working today. Back in the 80s, the moneymen were moneymen, largely allowing their filmmakers to go wild. There is a reason why so many of your favorite movies are specifically from the 80s. Much of today's pop culture is from the 80s and early 90s, which were kind of an extension of the 80s. By contrast, if we exclude comic book movies, how many of your all-time favorite movies are from the last 5 years, or even the last 10 years? There's a reason for that. Filmmakers today have more freedom in some ways, but they are more shackled in others, especially creative ways. The budgets are bigger, and so the risks are bigger, and the need to please everyone becomes paramount. But when everyone has to be pleased, you end up with something bland and safe that often, not always, but often, won't please anyone. As a general thing, the producers are more involved on the creative side today than they were before. And I do believe directors and producers falling out over creative differences just might be more prevalent today than it was back in the day. Many filmmakers are of course awarded great creative freedom and creative control, but even these filmmakers are expected to abide by some tacit rules. Denis Villeneuve, for instance, is allowed great creative freedom by Warner. But if he had wanted to include a subtextual comparison between, how do I put it, heteronormative relations and non-heteronormative preferences, like Lynch was allowed to do, no questions asked, then Villeneuve would have seen the creative freedom he had be reeled in real fast. Can't risk offending anyone. On the contrary, filmmakers will be asked to include certain concessions to ensure that they don't. So, which is better? The approach to storytelling and filmmaking of yesteryear or of today? Clearly, there were both upsides and downsides back then, and there are upsides and downsides today, and they are largely the same ones, only weighted differently. Many great standalone movies were made in the 80s that could never have been made today, certainly not in the form that they were made. But then again, there are some great examples of serialized storytelling from today we would never have gotten back then. So, which is better? I don't think there is a conclusive answer to that. And regardless of the era they are in, great filmmakers will find a way to work within the parameters of the time. That, ultimately, is what matters. Every era has its classics, waiting for future generations to discover them. On that note, I have a recommendation for you. Last fall saw the release of In Search of Darkness, the most comprehensive retrospective on the horror cinema of the 80s ever made. I cannot recommend it enough. It is a 4-hour documentary and interview extravaganza, covering just the kind of stuff that we do in our retrospectives and our star interviews. In addition to cast and filmmakers, it even includes some famous YouTubers like James Rolfe. Seeing it, and in the process rediscovering old classics plus new gems you might never have heard about before, will be well worth your time. It gets better though. The team behind it are already hard at work on a follow-up to it, namely In Search of Tomorrow, which is poised to be the most comprehensive retrospective of the science fiction movies of the 80s ever made. And there, some great productions will be covered, both that you already know and that are only waiting for you to discover them. It will also include the participation of some great YouTubers, like James Rolfe and Chris Stockman, and there's even a possibility of a Midnight's Edge contribution. In Search of Tomorrow is currently fundraising, and it blew past the minimum threshold required to make it in less than 24 hours of its launch on Kickstarter, so it is happening. But this is a scalable production, meaning the more resources put into it, the more epic will be the running time, the scale and the scope. So if you want to contribute towards it, the opportunity to do so is still there. Head on over to the description for an affiliate link to In Search of Tomorrow's Kickstarter, so they can see who sent you and you can see which rewards, even on-screen credit, you can get for your contribution should this be something you want to be part of. With that, let me know what you think of filmmaking today versus filmmaking of the 80s in the comments.